Good evening to those of you watching in Germany, and greetings to our international audience in various time zones throughout the world. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to this event, Trauma's Field of Distortion, which is being streamed as part of Kultursymposium Weimar's introductory program. My name is Tess Lewis, and I'm the curator and moderator for this event, which was co-organized by the Goethe-Institut, New York. The theme of this year's Kultursymposium Weimar is generations, and our event will explore how identity and memory shape the stories generations tell each other and themselves through the prisms of three profound, challenging novels. Pierre Jarawan's The Storyteller, translated by Sinead Crow and Rachel McNichol, Megha Majumdar's A Burning, and Maaza Mengiste's The Shadow King. These three novels all address the way traumatic history is transmitted, actively or passively, from generation to generation, and they examine the distorting effects trauma and shame exert on individual and collective identities. Our time today is very short, so I won't read the panelists' biographies. I encourage you to find them on the Kultursymposium's website. They will each read a short passage from their novels, followed by a brief discussion, and we'll conclude with a broader discussion. Megha, perhaps we could begin with you. A Burning follows the fate of Jivan, a young Muslim girl in the slums of Calcutta who witnesses a terrorist attack and writes a post on Facebook critical of the government. Because of this post, she's accused of collaborating with the terrorist and is instrumentalized by a far-right regional political party in their rise to power. A former gym teacher, PT Sir, who had previously taken her under his wing, now sees her predicament as an opportunity to advance in politics. And that starts a chain of events which doesn't end well for most of the characters anyway. So perhaps you could read a short passage to give us a sense of your style in the novel and the atmosphere.
Sure, thank you so much, Tess. It's such an honor to be here alongside you and Maaza and Pierre, so I'm very happy to do this. I'll read the passage that you suggested, which starts on page 272. And this section is PT Sir, the gym teacher that you referred to. It's his section, so I'll just read a few paragraphs. One morning begins with a red sun, light that slips around the curtain and finds his eyes, and it is the same as all other mornings, except it is wholly different. It is PT Sir's first day as an education secretary in the government. PT Sir lingers for as long as he can bear it at home, then dashes to his new office. The city is wide awake. Flocks of schoolgirls, some holding hands, cross the street before his car. Their ironed and pleated skirts, their big laughs, tug at who he used to be. A boy scrubs dishes with ash in the gutter before a street-side booth hawking noodles. A stray dog trots along, no longer able to bother the man in his car. Before the metal detector gates of the state government building, turbaned guards salute PT Sir. He wonders whether they know who he is, or whether they salute anybody who arrives in a government-issue white ambassador. One of the guards shows him to an elevator designed for use by VIPs only. In the rising compartment, heart drumming, PT Sir inspects his face in the shined metal doors. He may run into all sorts of VIPs in this building, from lobbyists to industrialists to movie stars. All have been known to discreetly visit this building. On the 7th floor corridor, PT Sir walks by a cleaning lady sitting on the pads of her feet, pushing a wet rag in wide arcs. She does not even glance up as he passes by. PT Sir unlocks the door to his new office with a brand new key. Inside, there's a tiny room, windowless. PT Sir closes the door behind him and sits in a chair with a high leather back. The chair tilts pleasingly under his weight. It rolls too, on wheels that do not get stuck. PT Sir sits like that for a few minutes, now and then tapping his fingers on the expanse of polished wood before him. Aside from a desktop computer and, puzzlingly, a packet of pencils, there's nothing else on the desk. The newness of it pleases him. Perhaps I'll stop there if that's okay.
Okay, sure. This passage is followed by a phone call he makes to a journalist where he suggests that maybe the mercy petition that might get Jivan's sentence reduced or get her out of jail needs to be channeled somewhere else. And the journalist finds himself co-opted without necessarily even agreeing to it or even knowing what he's agreeing to. And one of the primary forces in this novel, in the distortion field around trauma, is shame, particularly the profound cost of both resistance and moral compromise in the face of political violence. This reporter has gone to the prison and interviewed Jivan and finds his story being changed by his editor. He finds himself under pressure by this political upstart. The instinct to whitewash the price paid in conflict, whether we pay it in our own lives or at the mercy of others, is a powerful one. And P.T. Sir is not the only actor whose ambitions depend on Jivan's destruction. There's also an aspiring actor, Nhidra Lovely, who could offer evidence in support of her. But everyone does their own moral calculus for various motivations, again, shame being one of them. So Megha, how did you think about the power of shame in your characters' lives when you were constructing this work?
That's a great question, Tess. Shame operates in different ways in the lives of these characters. P.T. Sir, the gym teacher, he was somebody who supported the central character who's now in prison, but he started turning against her because of the sense that she was not adequately grateful to him. He felt jilted by her, and that, the kernel of that is the shame. How dare she reject me? And then shame operates in other ways too, like the other character you mentioned, Lovely, who, is marginalized in complex ways, is shamed by those around her, is told that she has a certain station in society and her dream of being a movie star is too big. It's not for her. But she turns that shame back on people every day on the streets by teasing them, by joking with them. When they're trying to put her down, she puts that shame back on them. So I found these two modes of shame turning into anger and shame turning into humor really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And the shame turned into humor is the least destructive. It's almost creative, even though it's still a dynamic of shame. It is far gentler than the other option. Mm-hmm. One thing that this novel illustrates very well is the way individual views, perspectives, contrary views, marginalized views can, if listened to, complicate the dominant narratives. So how conscious a choice was this multiplicity for you while writing?
I think the book's ambition when I started working on it was to ask, when there is this rise of hatred-filled right-wing nationalist ideology, how do people who are caught within that rise, how do they dream of something that is not just survival, but bigger than survival? How do they look for meaning within this system which thwarts generosity, thwarts justice, which pushes people into these moral positions where either I succeed or you have justice. We can't have both. You know, what does it do to their moral centers? So I was very conscious of how are these characters manipulated by the systems and institutions that they are caught within, but also within that, what are the ways in which they push back? What are the ways in which their ambitions become the site of seeking something greater?
Mm-hmm. This dynamic between the individual and being marginalized and finding a cause outside themselves is an important theme in your book as well, Maaza. And so I'd like to turn to The Shadow King, which recounts the Italo-Ethiopian War through the experiences of women soldiers and most centrally Hirut, who is an orphan and domestic servant, and whose only possession is an old rifle given to her by her father. And this becomes, you know, an important object in her dedication to a bigger cause. She's the one who notices a peasant's resemblance to Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's emperor, who has fled the conflict to England. And this peasant is given one of the emperor's uniforms, and he serves as a role model, or as his role is to inspire the troops as a shadow king. Another important figure in the novel, who's both central and marginalized, is Ettore, an Italian soldier who's Jewish, so his situation is precarious, and he's charged with creating a photographic record of Colonel Fucelli's accomplishments. And because most of these accomplishments are truly evil, Ettore realizes that he's become, as you put it, an archivist of obscenities and a collector of terror. But interestingly, these photographs also serve as a kind of resistance, as an act of bearing witness to the cruelties committed by his countrymen. He was tasked by his father to remember, to record what goes on, knowing his father had lived through the pogroms in Eastern Europe, knowing how easily conflict can escalate. And so these photographs bear witness to cruelty, but they also become a pivot with which to challenge orthodoxy and accepted histories. So perhaps you could read from the book and give us a sense of your style, of the role photographs play, and how you approach your characters.
Yes, thank you for that, Tess. And it is really a pleasure to be here, Megha and Pierre, and get a chance to talk with all of you. This is a section from the book. This is one of Ettore's photographs, and a particular boy that Ettore is photographing. Photo. A boy in a stained shirt rests his cheek against a tall boulder as if it were a father's chest. He stares at the camera, doe-eyed and curious, his lips folded around a mouthful of food, a stream of words, a cry for help, a burst of laughter. One palm balances against the hard surface of stone, his finger raised and pointed ahead, the gesture an accusation and a plea for patience. His small heels dip over the plateau's edge. His broad toes cling desperately to earth. What expands behind him is majestic and stupefying, a vast landscape of tall mountains and merciless rocks, a gaping ravine that drops out of view, breathtaking even in this frozen glimpse. His face, a blur of tender features, the shaking head moving faster than shutter speed, swinging left, then right, then left again in defiance and horror. What cannot be captured, that he repeats his name until that final free fall. Zarihun, Zarihun, Zarihun. And the ricochet of his voice is the earth's mournful lament, land tempering its cruelty. They say their names and demand to know his. They drag themselves toward the threshold and collapse to the ground in mindless laughter. Light wavers around their sluggish figures, unsteady bodies sinking into haze. Ettore leans in, arches close, orders Askari to keep them still, but it is impossible to get a steady shot. The last push is desperate. It is a plea for normalcy, a return to control and command. The prisoners tip over the edge with soft bones, relieved and graceless, and all Ettore can photograph are awkward figures buckling into empty space, shouting their names into a gulf that multiplies their voices, a repetitive, deafening chorus. They spill over the edge as if gliding underwater, drowning and surging up for air, spinning between a rapturous dream and a paralyzing nightmare. Ghastly shapes of unspeakable words, dark marks against the sky. And then I will read one more passage. When Ettore meets Hirut, who was a soldier fighting against the Italians, someone whom he photographed also, and they're meeting 40 years after the war. Then when Ettore walks into the station with his shoulders slightly raised from the memory of a camera he was wise not to bring with him, Hirut stands. For a moment, she has to feel her dress to make sure it is on, that she is not naked before him, shaking in loathing and humiliation as Fucelli orders, again, Soldato, take another picture. Hirut straightens. She lifts her chin and stares at Ettore as he pauses and looks at her, recognition and shame rippling through light and shadow to shrink the space between them. And when he takes a step in her direction, nervous and bewildered, Hirut salutes. He pauses, nearly stumbles, and between them the valley expands and gunpowder rises in the breeze to choke them both. But he keeps moving forward as if he has been expecting this, as if he has prepared himself for this moment, has been getting ready for it since the last time they faced each other on the battlefield. Ettore walks toward her as if the path to forgiveness lay between them, as if the years erase scars and photographs and history, as if that hand stretching out to grasp Hirut's can raise the dead and return all he has stolen. He expects pity. This much she can see through the haze of old battles and the unearthly silence. He expects the years not to have hardened her fury. He expects to walk toward her as if he has never worn a uniform, as if he did not mold himself to fit its contours. Here is the truth he wants to ignore, that what is forged into memory tucks itself into bone and muscle. It will always be there, and it will follow us to the grave. I'll stop there.
That's a wonderful passage. And the image of memory being tucked into bone and flesh is very striking. And it's a counterweight to the way memory is preserved in photographs. But what you do so marvelously well is you implement the destabilizing force of photographs into your narratives. For example, in the excerpt you just read, the boy's lips are folded around a mouthful of food, a stream of words, a cry for help, a burst of laughter, all of these and none. It's, a picture can tell 1,000 words. It can also tell 1,000 stories. When I was preparing for this event, I was translating a series of poems by an Austrian poet the series was inspired by old photographs of Vienna. And I was struck by these lines in connection to the Shadow King. The report of moments arrayed in pictures that tell a fleeting story, yet conceal everything that actually happened. And that's the sense I got reading The Shadow King, is everything is revealed and everything is concealed. And could you talk a bit about what photographs reveal and conceal in your understanding of history?
Yes, thank you for that, Tess. I'd love to know who the author is too when we get done with this. That's a really wonderful quote. In looking at photographs that soldiers took in Ethiopia, photographs that they chose to bring back with them. I realized that these were mementos, in a sense, to curate their memory, and a way to help them remember those things that they wanted to remember. They wanted to remember themselves in a very particular way, and they would not take other photographs so that they could, I think, forget that aspect. And I wondered about the ways that the way they chose to preserve certain memories of themselves could actually reveal something else they didn't intend. Because I, as an Ethiopian looking at it, would be more aware of the history than let's say, the families that they took these photographs back to. And I wondered about the way that the people who were photographed, who were often East Africans, Ethiopians, might have left clues in those images that someone like me, generations later, could look at and recognize something unspoken that might rest even outside of the frame. And I wanted to look at images as a distortion of an actual event, because those images that power makes is really supposed to reflect back the power that's holding the camera, whoever that is. And I began to look at these images that the soldiers took as self-portraits, regardless of whatever it was that they were photographing, whether it was an East African or whether it was a building or what, any of that. And that revealed a lot to me about the kinds of memories that were being curated that would then become called history, because history is a curation of events by whoever it is that's doing that gathering. And what I found again and again, and which is reflected in that scene that I wrote, is that Ethiopians who were being photographed, East Africans, I was even looking at some photographs from Libya. There were moments of resistance, and if you knew how to look, you could see that people would suddenly move right when the camera's going so that the face would be blurred, or they would suddenly just turn a certain way. And I would see these again and again and begin to understand what was actually happening.
That's fascinating, the idea of approaching these photographs as self-portraits. Another element along with the photographs that has an almost talismanic power in your novel, which we saw in this excerpt, are names. The Ethiopian prisoners, as we heard, repeat their names before they're executed. And one character, known as the cook, refused to reveal her true name when she was forced into slavery. And throughout the whole novel, she conceals it. She never gives it up. And finally, Hirut, in I think an absolutely devastating scene, tells Kidane, who has repeatedly raped her and humiliated her, she nevertheless reveres as a commander. When he's dying on the battlefield, she cradles him in her arms and tells him, "Your name will be forgotten, but mine will be remembered," knowing that that is not true. But it was such a devastating kind of vengeance. There's so much in the book that made my blood run cold, but this did particularly well. So talk about your names and what they signify for you in the context of the Shadow King.
Names, I think in most cultures are really significant. My last name, my surname is my father's first name. And if I know his second name, surname, I know his father's first name. And this is how we learn generations of our family. My mother keeps her father's name, even in marriage, after marriage. So I know her lineage. Coming to the United States, understanding that I carried that history with me, it was part of who I am. Every time someone speaks my name, they speak my family. Was important, especially as a little African kid who went into a place that had no idea how to deal with her. It was important. And I know that names ground so many different cultures in a particular, not just country, but a particular place within that country. And I wanted to reflect that in my characters. When they say their names as they're being killed, they are forcing the Italians to recognize what is actually being taken. The cook recognizes or understands the power of a name, but because she has been stolen from her family and enslaved, the name is the one thing she will not give. So everyone, including me, calls her the cook. She didn't reveal it, throughout the book. I discovered it much later in the writing process.
But you still didn't give it up, which is,
right.
I think the only option, truly.
Yeah.
Pierre, names are complicated in your book. Your characters adopt identities for various reasons, expediency and strategy and necessity, and also photographs. In The Storyteller, the narrator, Samir, is haunted by a photograph of his missing father. Samir's parents fled Lebanon for Germany in 1983. Samir was born in Germany, but his father's Lebanon, which no longer existed by the time Samir was conscious, but it existed for Samir. It dominates his life and his imagination. Samir's father disappears without warning when he's 8 years old, and Samir finds himself unable to get on with his life as an adult until he can find some kind of closure, find his father, or find out about him. And only after a long search does he find that the photograph, which has been so definitive for him, has more than one story to tell. So perhaps you could read a passage and we'll speak about the novel and names and stories for you.
Yeah, thank you, Tess, and thank you to both of Megha and Maaza to read from your novels. I really loved hearing that. Before I read my passage, may I add something about photography and memory, because it says something very interesting about this topic when you talk about Lebanon, because at some point in the Lebanese Civil War in the 80s, there were no chemicals left for families to develop their films or to bring them somewhere to get the film developed. So what they did and what journalists also did was they took a picture. They always had a notebook with them, and then they wrote, frame number 1, for example, and they wrote into their notebook, frame number 1, for example, kitchen table, a cake on the table, 4 candles, a birthday, and I love that because somehow it's you remember the photograph you just took, and by trying to capture it into words, you're already changing history, right? Because a memory is unreliable, and by you're not just looking at the picture and describe it, but you remember the moment, and you write down what happened instead of seeing, and this is already where history is being changed, by talking about it. And this is, for me, it's a metaphor about how history is dealt with in Lebanon and many other countries, of course, as well. But yeah, and that's why the photograph in my book is somehow important as well, because it's in the description of the picture, basically everything is there, but as a reader, we look at the wrong details, and that's why we are misled for the rest of the story. But let me read it. It's a story from a passage where the family is in the living room, and the father of Samir is showing pictures of Lebanon to the family, or to Samir especially, who has never seen Lebanon by his own eyes. And then, he has already shown some pictures, and then the following happens. Looking back, I think he just picked up the wrong slide in his excitement, because he wasn't watching what he was doing. My guess is he meant to pick the one next to it. The slide he actually showed us, he had been moved to the back of the bunch on purpose. He had filtered it out so that it wouldn't end up in the projector, so that we wouldn't get to see it. The projector rattled. My mother glanced at the photo, looked away, then back again suddenly, as if she had to convince herself it was really there. At the right-hand edge of the image stood my father beside a good-looking young man with thick black hair, dark brown eyes, and an engaging smile. They were posing beneath a chandelier in a large foyer, a white carpeted staircase with a gilt banister behind them. The man beside father was wearing a uniform and had a gun tucked into his belt. There was a cedar stitched onto the left breast of his shirt, a cedar with a red circle around it. Next, I studied father. He was very young and seemed almost shy. The look in his eyes, today I'd describe it as dreamy, didn't quite match the rest of the scene. Father was smiling a dreamy smile and saluting. He was wearing the same uniform as the other man, and he too had a gun tucked into his belt. There are moments when you think about asking a question but decide not to. Your antennae sense a barrier. Your intuition tells you it's not the right time for that question. But years later, when you know more than you did then, you regret. You regret not asking the question. The one question that might have explained everything. Why he was wearing a uniform, for example. Why he had a gun. Who the man was beside him. It would have made things so much easier. Father stared at the picture as if he didn't recognize himself. There he was on our living room wall, large as life, standing beside a man who looked as if his uniform was a second skin, as if he'd been wearing it his whole life. I can only speculate now what thoughts went through Father's mind in that moment, what feelings the slide must have triggered, what memories, what pain even. We all stared at the picture. Nobody said a word for what seemed like an eternity. Then my sister began to squirm and cry on my lap. Mother snapped out of her stunned silence and took the wriggling bundle from me. She left the room, rocking the baby in her arms. Father turned off the projector and slid out of the room with his head bowed. I stayed behind. A second earlier, I'd wanted to ask him the story behind that picture. Now I'd decided not to.
There is a story behind the picture for Samir, and it changes, the story changes as he gets different facts and perspectives. In The Storyteller, you have two sons searching for their father's legacy in newspapers, eyewitness accounts, documents that are not part of the official history. And in fact, you have a group of university students putting themselves in great danger by creating an alternate archive of suppressed information. And so when you were researching for this novel and thinking about how to present it, how did you balance conflicting historical accounts to tell your story?
Yeah, I mean, in the description of this event, there's a quote by Walter Benjamin that, history is being made by the victors, but he obviously has never been to Lebanon because, there was no victors. Of course, the poet is older than, but the conflict in Lebanon ended without, there was no victors who could have written history. So that means what you have in Lebanon is 18 different versions of history, because you have 18 different religious groups coexisting in this tiny country. And so you have 18 different stories, basically, of guilt and innocence, of experiences of violence, and the question in which society you are raised or you are born into, it basically defines what kind of understanding of history you grow up with, because there will always be the others, and you will always be belonging to the one who's innocent, to the only one who's innocent, of course, and all the others. But this goes for 18 different religions. So it was very difficult to have this, to put all this together and to give an image that is free from opinion, you know, but basically that is kind of describes the chaos. And I think that's what was the most authentic thing, is to make to the reader experience the chaos of this aftermath of the war. And I think what also happened was the distance, you know, me growing up in Germany and not having been part of this and not having experienced all of this. But you know, looking at it from the perspective of a writer and from someone who wants to know more, and this really helped me to remain, you know, at least a bit distant. And because I think, you know, the medieval cartographers, when they drew their maps, they wrote a sentence into that part of the maps. They were, you know, that nobody had ever been there. And they wrote Hic sunt leones in Latin, which means here are lions, to say that this is a potentially dangerous part of the map. And this describes my writing approach, I think. I love to open up new territories for myself, and I'd like to go where the lions possibly live, and this means, you know, to open up territory for myself by doing the research, by having to do the research, and by doing that, learning a lot about, you know, myself and also the country my parents come from, but also opening up to the readers a new territory, which is in this case Lebanon, to a, well, in the first case, German audience, but then through the translations, you know, into English and French and Spanish and so on, it's basically people anywhere can read it. So I think, yeah, this was my approach.
Well, I think Hic sunt leones could be written on the cover of any of these novels. There's I think, dangerous territory in each of them. Is your novel published in Lebanon?
It's published in Lebanon, but not in Arabic. So they read it in English and French, and it hasn't been translated to Arabic yet.
And what kind of response did it get? How did Lebanese readers react to it? Did they see you as an interloper in their history, or as shedding a light on? Yeah,
more the last, because I mean, it's not, unfortunately, it's not, you know, a country of many bookstores and a vivid publishing scene. So I think if you are a reader in Lebanon, you already are educated or open-minded, and not so much, you know, so you don't stick to your perspective. So when I get feedback from readers in Lebanon, they are thankful that I, you know, mentioned these themes in my novel, and they think that it's important to talk about the past, which doesn't happen. And so yeah.
Maaza, I imagine that the novel for Ethiopian readers is a wonderful affirmative experience. And I know the Italian translation was just published. How was it received in Italy? I know Fucelli is based on a historical figure, correct?
He's a composite of several figures that I know of. The Italians, it's what I get repeatedly, that this is an uncomfortable history for Italians to confront or read, even in fiction. Most Italians don't know this history. It was not taught in history books, or it might have had one or two lines. And so I think the responses have been overwhelmingly positive for right now. But I always think with a book, it takes time for the opposition to really wake up and hear about what's being written. So Italy is moving further right in their government. You know, there's still a pretty strong fascist population there. There's been a lot of education and pushback against that, but I'm curious to see what will happen as the book continues to live, because it was just published. I'm I'm not sure what will happen, but it's been really positive right now, and I've been really grateful.
Yes, it will be interesting to see as it gets more notice and as read more. I'm sure it will touch more nerves. And Megha, inevitably, a burning touches any number of nerves in India at the moment. Have you gotten a response from Indian readers?
I have to say I haven't been following it very closely. I've just kind of let the book have its own life. I have heard from people, you know, that they've enjoyed it, that they found it provocative in an interesting way. I'm sure there are people who didn't like it, which is great. But, you know, if there are readers who are there in Kolkata, where I grew up, who see the reality of the city around them in this book, if it helps them to think or question their own beliefs or what they read in the news, even a little bit, I'll be very happy.
Yes, and I imagine that the type of opposition whose toes it would step on are not likely to pick up this kind of novel. It's so exhilarating to read these novels that both affirm an understanding, a critical understanding of history, and push back against things that are taken for granted. Unfortunately, our time for this segment is almost up. Thank you to the audience watching us live. There will be an additional 15-minute segment available for later viewing in the Mediathek on the Kultur Symposium Weimar's website. And so I encourage you to follow the conversation with us there if you are able. So thank you very much for joining us. Welcome back to you viewers who couldn't get enough from our initial conversation. I have so many more questions that even this secondary 15-minute segment will not be enough for us. But my first question, or the first theme I'd like to address with the three of you is about physical violence. Maaza, you deal with it most directly. There's an enormous amount of physical and emotional violence against the powerless, the marginalized, and especially and always women. It's still a potent tool of intimidation and control, and we're seeing that right now in Ethiopia, unfortunately. Rape as a tool of war, actually, throughout many countries. But I would be interested to hear from you about the process of depicting these harrowing scenes, especially when the suffering doesn't ennoble, but degrades and demoralizes. How did you manage to inhabit these scenes?
That is a really good question. It was a process to get closer and closer and closer to whatever was happening, to that trauma, until I could begin to inhabit the space, or actually be in the skin of not only the people who were suffering, but also eventually the people who were inflicting that pain. My novel is told from several perspectives, and I deliberately wanted to choose, I wanted to do it that way because I wanted to look at this cycle of violence in a more prismatic way, to be able to look at it from many different angles. One of the things that I wanted to make sure in both my depictions of someone who was suffering and someone who was inflicting this pain was that I complicated those characters, that I complicated lives so that it feels like human beings who are in that intimate space of cruelty together. I imagined that that space of cruelty is a kind of relationship between someone who is enacting the violence and someone who is receiving that violence. There's a relationship that is established. And I wanted to follow that thread between those people and see how deep it goes and where else it leads me. And often what I found was that when I would follow that thread into the person who is inflicting the violence, what I found inside their life was other kinds of violence, other forms of pain, other kinds of trauma. And that was the only way that I could render those scenes, is by understanding the two human beings that were in one way or another communicating with each other. The people who were suffering that violence, in whatever way that the scene was written, I also made sure that I tried to give them some form of dignity, some form of speaking back, whether it's saying their name as they're being killed, whether it's refusing to look down, whatever way. I think that there are those small acts of heroism that we lose sight of. And I wanted, even if somebody ends up dead, that the body retains a kind of dignity that I would try to reflect in my words. Otherwise, I couldn't have done it. It was dark enough to be there and write that for any length of years.
Yes, yeah. Megha, we talked about humor as a defense mechanism, and you carry that demoralizing, humiliating effect of violence on Lovely with her banter and her teasing. But Jivan is subject to an enormous amount of cruelty and suffering, both emotional and physical, as was her mother. And, you know, it is a thread throughout the book, rarely redemptive, not at all redemptive, but actually, now that I think of it. And there's violence in every society, but in certain aspects of life in India, it seems a bit closer to the surface, especially these days with the far right being so provocative and inciting violence against others. How did you see violence integrating into your characters' lives? And how did you weave it into the fabric of the book?
You know, like Maaza was just saying, I think allowing characters complexity and allowing them dignity and willpower and agency and choices, even in those moments when they are most close to a very physical form of oppression. I think that was really important for Jivan, who's the central character in the book. She's facing violence in the form of this prison sentence. And her way of responding to that is to realize that the system which is crushing her will not be the one to rescue her. So she has to find a different avenue of escape. And for her, that proves to be, well, she thinks it's going to be the news media. So she tries to get her narrative out, and she tries to put forward a narrative which will be persuasive to the public, because she realizes how much of the court's opinion depends on public opinion in this society. But also, you know, when there are moments of physical violence, I felt that the book throughout, it circles various forms of injustice, right? So I felt that it could not shy away from the ugliest expression of this hateful ideology. I felt that that would be, you know, not very truthful. So there is a small section of violence toward the end of the book. And for writing that, I was thinking about how to make sure that each word here needs to belong, that the section is no longer than it needs to be, which is why it's a very short, very compressed section. And it's interesting now that I'm thinking about it, because it was one of the earliest sections that I wrote and that stayed kind of intact over lots of drafts. So it was kind of the core that the book was circling in all of these other scenes. And I just needed the reader who has, by that point in the book, encountered all of these other forms of violence to understand that this is where it might lead.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Pierre, the violence in your novel is less explicit than in Megha's and Maaza's. The violence is sort of pervasive and atmospheric, and your characters, central and secondary, all suffer very much at the hands of violence. But what seems more interesting or more crucial in your book to me is the way these characters respond to violence and how they attempt to save their dignity, even when it means betraying their friends or their family. How did you think about violence in the context of, the Lebanon that you're depicting, that Samir goes to find, sort of retrace the fallout from violence that his father and his father's friends suffered?
Yeah, I mean, writing about, I think this is a difficulty anyone who writes encounters at some point. If you cover the topics like these, to write about violence or violent pasts without, being a voyeur, without being voyeuristic about it, or to just use it as a suspenseful scene just to entertain the readers, because this would be terribly wrong. It has to make sense within the story and within the context of what you are telling. So I think a lot of the violence that happens in my book comes from the absence of language. Actually, it comes from silence, and because lots of conflicts that happened in the book, they could have been prevented if the characters just spoke to each other, which they are unable to. And I think this silence is the result of violence that happened before. I mean, the father, he's the storyteller that gives the name of the book. And I wanted to show that there are two kinds of storytelling. There's storytelling in order to reveal something, and there's storytelling in order to cover something. It can be both. And while Samir, as the narrator of this novel, tries to reveal his story, his father's story, and try to dealing with it, his father uses storytelling to cover things up, and also to cover his own silence, because he uses stories, so he doesn't have to talk father to son about his past. He uses fairy tale like stories as metaphors, and this silence is critical to anything that happens in the book, because it's critical to anything that happens in Lebanon. Actually, there's silence everywhere. There are stories everywhere, but if you look closely, they come from silence.
We only have a few minutes left, but this is a perfect segue into my final, well, unfortunately, be my final question, and that is the power of storytelling. It can be destructive, but I don't want viewers to get the impression that these novels are exclusively bleak. There's storytelling in each of them in its own way is affirmative, it's redemptive. There is a great deal of nobility that comes through storytelling. And maybe, Pierre, you could say a few words about storytelling as a positive, powerful force.
Yeah, I mean, So the Storyteller it's my first novel, and it came out in Germany. It came out in 2015, and only in 2019 it came out in English. So, but my second novel came out just a few months ago in Germany. It's called Ein Lied für die Vermissten. In English, it's a song for the missing. It will be out in English next year, and it's about the 17,000 missing in Lebanon. You know, they are still missing from the Civil War. Nobody knows where they are, what happened there. But it's so. And there's one sentence in this book that might answer your question, because it's I don't know the translation yet, but if I would translate it from my head to English, it would be something like, you know, stories, they cannot bring back what is lost, but they can make what has been lost experienceable. You know, they can make it vivid again, and nobody in Germany has ever heard of, you know, 17,000 missing people in Lebanon. But if they read the story and they will learn about it, and they will not only learn about it in a historical way, but they will experience it, because it's a story. And I can tell you about, you know, I can name facts. You know, 17,500 is an abstract number. I can say so many people have left Syria or Lebanon because of the Civil War. So many people have drowned in the Mediterranean by trying to come to Europe. We are immune to these numbers, you know, because they go to the head, and I think stories can go to the heart, and that's the difference. It's basically the same. But a number becomes a character, and the character becomes associated with feelings and so on. You can relate to, and this is why news go to the head and stories go to the heart. Maybe that's.
Well, that's a perfect description, actually, of my sense of Hirut. I know, Maaza, that your great-grandmother was a woman soldier and had a rifle, just sued for the right to possess her own rifle, but she went to war as a soldier. And so how do you see Pierre's comment of storytelling making what is lost, not retrieving it, but making it experienceable?
Absolutely. I really love that quote. And I'm looking forward to the book when it comes out in English. I absolutely think that those storytelling brings back and helps us re-experience, and I think changes us when we hear those stories from the past. You know, I now see my great-grandmother in a completely different light. I always knew she was stubborn, but I had no idea that she had gone to enlist in war. I know that we're short on time, but it has brought her back to me in ways, and I carry that. I know that's in my blood, that's in my name, you know, this history, and it helps me move forward into this American life.
And, you know, we are all the richer for your grandmother's story being brought to us in a different form, but nonetheless, you know, we're able to experience that a bit as well. Megha, so much is lost in the universe that is India, the stories of the powerless. And one thing that A Burning does is give a great deal of nobility and depth to characters that would otherwise just sort of, that are completely expendable. How did storytelling change your view of the different areas of society that you were trying to depict in your novel?
I agree with, you know, everything that Pierre and Maaza just said, and perhaps I can add that writing this novel helped me move up and down the scale of the questions that I was interested in. Because part of it is, you know, you hope that somebody is encouraged to think about institutions and justice systems and media and how that operates and all of those big questions. But then in the novel, I can also come back to these individuals who, you know, I really hope are not representatives of anything, but they are just these complex, contradictory individuals who succeed in some ways, fail in some ways, try to get some things, hold certain beliefs, but then don't act accordingly. And I hope that storytelling, when when it's pushed to be its most complex iteration, can give us these characters who are not ideals, are not mouthpieces, cannot be reduced to a message, but through their kind of heightened humanness can encourage us to enter these questions in ways that we feel able.
Perhaps, you know, we'll quote Maaza's comment earlier as a conclusion to this event, and that is, by complicating lives, we make them richer. We certainly make our own richer by understanding the complexity of others' lives. I would like to thank all three of you so much, Megha, Pierre, and Maaza, for an illuminating hour. I wish we had several more to continue the discussion. But I very much appreciate your availability and your comments and your books, most of all. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a pleasure. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.